Rachel said that you got into Pitt State early?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah?
Yeah. I know, it's crazy. I guess I'll let anyone in there.
I got in too.
Oh, really? Wow,
Yeah.
that's amazing.
I know. How's your movie for Rachel going?
Oh, good. Man, Pitt State,
I
that's
know,
crazy.
yeah.
And what, we got prom coming in like 4 months?
Yeah. I know, but I'm excited for your movie.
Yeah, me too. Hi, Rachel. Earl's right. All the ways that we tried to make a film for you just kind of turned out completely horrible, so... Yeah. It got me thinking about the reason that we wanted to make this film for you in the first place, and you know, when it comes right down to it, and you just say it without screwing around, I believe in you. You can do it.
It is indeed a difficult time for the Shenley High School family. We are mourning a family member, but we have an unexpected and touching opportunity to turn our thoughts to her in a unique way. Earl Jackson, Gregory Gaines, please come to the stage. These boys made a film that they delivered to Rachel last night, and her mother has given us permission to share it with all of you. Before we start the film, is there anything you would like to say to the Shenley High School family?
No.
Gregory?
This film sucks. And after you watch it, you're gonna think I'm this pathetic, untalented loser. But, you know, I don't really care anymore.
I spent the last 4 years obsessing over how everyone sees me, and I just realized that I don't care anymore. Because the only person whose opinion that I care about is dead now.
She died last night. So, whatever.
You know, I've always wanted to never really be noticed by anyone, and I realized that the best way to not be noticed is to be dead. And I don't want to be dead. Okay, here's why our film sucks, okay? It's not the film we should have made. Because I wasn't even friends with Rachel before she got sick. And then she got sick and we started spending all this time together, but it wasn't enough. Okay, it just wasn't. To make the film we should have made, we should have gotten her to tell us every single thought she's ever had. Because it's all just lost now. We should have had a camera on her constantly since the day she was born, because her whole life now it's lost, and we should have had a camera inside her head to pick up on all her specific thoughts and ideas and dreams and phobias and impressions of the whole stupid world, because it's all about to be lost. And the film that we should have made would keep her from being lost. And I know it happens to everyone, and it'll happen to everyone in this room, and it'll happen to me, but the point is, it happened to her, and it happened last night, and I can't deal with that, and I'll never be able to deal with it, and this film just has nothing to do with that. Nothing. Okay? So yeah, it sucks. I'm sorry. Nothing sucks more than this.
nice little movie about Rachel's life.
Oh,
When will it be in the theaters?
soon, really soon. I'm sure Denise will tell you.